thanks for being here, Mayra and Mike. I'm super excited to have this conversation on innovation. So the reason why I ended up, or why I'm hosting Sustainable Transformation Camp at all, is because I've spent some 10 years in a materials company, but then relating to plastics, and where we've had an innovation that's sort of, I wouldn't say it's even paradigm shifting, but it's like a completely different take on how to make flame retardants in plastic. And so it's an innovation that we've been trying to push and market into the world, and we've found that it's extremely difficult to get it to come through, especially on like a large scale, to come to scale. And then I also think want to frame it by saying, like, when we talk about sustainability, a lot of people are saying, like, oh, it's no problem, we'll just innovate our way out of that. And like, oh, technology is the solution. So there's also that view of sustainability that I wanted to kind of allow for and hold. And I think that's interesting, but I also think that there's so much more to say. And I also know how hard innovation can be. So it's super exciting to have both of you here to like share your perspectives and to have a conversation, a very open conversation, I think, about sort of innovation in general, what it takes to be good at it, and then pivot more towards like how can we do that in relation to sustainability, like what is required for us to become sustainable, or start that exploration deeper. So I think I'm gonna switch over here to my little notes, but I'm thinking you get to introduce yourself, and the invitation was with one sentence, and then also your biggest innovation related failure or seeming failure.
Great, I can start. My name is Mike Pilliod. I work at Tesla, and I manage and lead all the glass development across the whole company. I've been at Tesla for about 6.5 years, and prior to that, I was at Apple in their product design team for a similar amount of time, about 6 years there, doing glass development and new materials introductions. I've been super fortunate. I'm going to go well over a sentence, I guess. Sorry, I've been able to. I came to California in 2007. I have my backgrounds in materials and ceramic engineering and glass science, and I got a great opportunity to come to the West Coast and work for companies that truly value engineering and also failure and trying things out and doing new stuff. I live in California, and right now I guess my biggest innovation's probably been towards like within Tesla and Apple's like applying glass in places that it hasn't really been applied before. So like if you look at every Tesla, our fingerprints for my team, and I represent not only this myself, but a great team at Tesla that's been able to apply glass across every single vehicle. So every vehicle we have, our fingerprints are all over the product. And definitely my biggest failure is I am responsible for the Cybertruck glass failure that was seen by God knows how many people, maybe 30 million. I have my t-shirt on, which is like, they made a t-shirt out of it. I have,
yay!
I caught, that night I did grab, this is the ball that was thrown at it. And then I have a piece of the broken glass here. So that's my viral failure
that's a really big
innovative
ball though. Like
things. It was definitely it was a good failure. And definitely not a mistake, a failure, which I'm sure we'll get into in the conversation. But I'm excited to be part of this thing. I think I got connected via some of the work. I was a colleague that I know at Absolute, and she introduced me to Niles, and I met Ahmed. So I'm really quite inspired to be around like people that want to do different stuff and do new stuff. That's me.
So happy to have you.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Mayra.
Yeah, so my name is Mayra Kapteyn. I am the co-founder of Inc. Social Design. What we're trying to do, or what we've been doing for the past 2 years. We've only really gone live 2 years now. We work together with researchers, psychologists mostly, to create technology that brings out the best in people. And that it very often has to do with sustainability, but it also has to do a lot with mental health and inclusivity, those kind of themes. And before that, I was with 29K in Sweden. Some of you might know that. And yeah, I lived all across Europe a little bit, worked everywhere. And yeah, so my, okay, so more than one sentence, but I think how I would explain myself is that my background is in psychology. And when I was studying psychology, it kind of just baffled me. Like, if we know all this stuff about what people need to feel well and feel happy and behave in line with their values, why don't we design the world according to it? I could just not understand why we were raising all these people, educating all these people to be one-on-one psychologists without looking at the bigger picture and thinking, okay, how are these systems actually designed? What are they doing to us? So I kind of wanted to become a psychologist for the masses in a way. And via that, I chose to do a second master's in design. And so I'm a psychologist turned designer, you could say. And my biggest failure in the innovation space has nothing to do with glass, has a lot to do with psychology, actually, of course. Like that was actually the only, like the real thing that I can also share, because of a lot of the work is under NDA, but just something that is actually quite personal is that what I've learned over the past 2 years, the way I've failed a few times, is that if we would get really busy and we would have lots of projects,
Oh no.
failure energy within my team. So I would stop taking care of myself. I would also kind of
Mayra, stop.
that
Sorry,
energy.
we lost you
into
for
the
like
team.
a few seconds.
Oh.
Could you go back to the, because we heard you up to a lot of projects, like where you have a lot of projects.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I don't know why my internet is unstable right now. It's been great all day.
Technology doesn't like us.
We just had a thunderstorm, maybe that's
innovate
it.
something. Yeah, somebody
Somebody innovate this shit.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, the biggest failure would be whenever we would have lots of projects going on at the same time, I would kind of stop taking care of myself. And the failure there was mostly that I didn't realize that I was the emitter of energy to the wider team. And so if I would not manage my energy and not take care of myself, I could also not, that energy emits into the team. So though that is my biggest failure, I think, of this past few years, at least at Inc. Or actually everywhere I go. I was like, since I realized like, oh, I'm the emitter of energy, okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, and also just for the structure of the conversation, I was thinking we'd talk for a while, just the three of us, and then we'll open it up for anybody to join in, and then we'll see how time is managed. We didn't have time to do it yesterday. I just sort of invited to it, but we might do an inquiry together if people feel inclined. Now we're like a tiny and little, intimate team, so we'll just take it as it goes.
Great.
But one of the things that so we had a pre-call. I have to admit, we did prepare for this, and one of the things that I thought was pretty cool about that was just the initial question, which is like, so if you guys would both share, like, what is innovation to you?
Sure, I can give it a shot. It's kind of a broad term, and in some sense, it's sort of my day-to-day job, if you will. I think innovation in my world is it's not doing new for new sake, but new to solve a somewhat of either in a goal or a defined problem. And I think often it can kind of, like, for me, it needs to be blended with sort of a direct outcome that you would want to do, whether that outcome is positive or negative, or you fail or trip along the way, at least you're focused, so you don't get into a I think there's in research and development in the world that I spend most of my time in development land as far as innovation and development, and not necessarily core research. And that's just my personal view on innovation. I think there's scientists that I really like who get very much focused on their level of like innovation in their research world, and it's pretty well defined, it's pretty well controlled. My sort of style of innovation is more chaotic in a sense, so less controlled, less defined, and being in that space. So for me, it's I think there's like I also deal in sort of like most comfortable in disruptive innovation, so something that is sort of going to change the process of how to do something versus maybe sustaining innovation or improvement of sort of continuous improvement thing. So I think in general, there's all sorts of different flavors for me that like sort of like true disruptive innovation. So something that's going to really stir things up or change the process for the better, whether that's better operationally. In my current world, it's how do we just do things to make more vehicles, to make more solar panels, to make more to sort of industrialize Tesla. That's what I spend most of my time on, is looking for innovation. So that's sort of the key goal of the driver, and then how we get there is completely undefined. So that's where the disruptive comes in. So that's my initial thought on it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good description of what innovation means. I'm hearing disruptive. I think there can be like incremental as well as more radical innovation, right? And I think the most beautiful innovations that I see often, there's a part technological information, but there's part meaning innovation. And very often the things that work really well speak to some kind of very human universal truth in a different way. So they create meaning in a different way. By using technology, for example, but it's never just technology for technology's sake, but I think in that interaction between meaning and technology.
Yeah, I agree. I think it has that I think innovation is also something that's not you can't sit around a table and be that innovative. I don't think you got to go out and do something to try something that's different than something that people have done before. So I think that also, like in sort of because it's a hot word right now, but in my world, innovation is really hard work. You got to go do a bunch of work and collect a bunch of data and come back and present it. And so it takes real work. You have to have overalls on, and you have to be ready to go to work when you do it. So I think there's sort of like a trade and a craft to innovation as well. And I think the best thing about it is it kind of has for me, the best thing about it is you surround yourself with a lot of people who have a true trade or a true craft and a very deep depth in a certain area. So that it tends to be, when you're in sort of innovation, you're around people who the smartest person in the room changes when the conversation changes. And that to me is why I spend most of my time in it, because you get to be around very deep people in depth. And if people want to get into it, I think that's a key thing, is you got to have mine's just been glass, so I've been riding that wave for a while, but it's you're very deep in that expertise, and then can be broad as far as approaching multiple people.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and then my role is usually to work with people such as you, if I would be working with glass, but just kind of connecting the experts together. So, for example, in trying to innovate in the poverty space, how do we deal as a government in how we get people out of debt more quickly? Then we work with like the top-notch researchers on that have really an extremely well sourced vision of why it's currently not working, and how it could be different. But then putting that into form, you need to connect that with people that are working with it day to day, and then extract all these perspectives. And that's kind of the role as a designer, at least in my studio, that we're quite generalist, but we are just really good at listening to the experts. So I think that's where it it's always a crossover between different expertises. And I think there's really a process, and how do you handle that, and how do you handle, that's the hard work. I think, Mike, you were talking about, like not knowing where it's going to end up, not having that security.
I think.
No, go
ahead. Oh, go ahead, Emmett. Sorry. Yeah.
No, sorry. Go.
I was going to say every once in a while you have. I think it also takes a deep baseline understanding of what industry you're going to think. So when Mayra would say poverty, I imagine that to be innovative in it, you'd actually have to know about it and have a very deep understanding of your baseline thing. So what I always think is somebody who comes in, sometimes somebody comes in from the outside and can take a shot at something or have an idea that's truly innovative, but it's very rare for that to happen, versus somebody who's deep in the knowledge base of what you're trying to solve. I think that's also a key one. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's actually what I wrote down. I think it's collective imagination. I think that is what it is really about, that, because it is never the answer of one person or one expertise. It's always the answer of different perspectives coming together and then collectively imagining a different solution or even a different way of looking at the problem. So as a designer, you can empathize all you want, but sorry.
No, I just wanted to highlight that because it seems like you're both really getting to it. And that's, I think also from what I've seen is with innovative people, I mean, it's a little bit of an orthogonal way of thinking of reframing a problem, perhaps from a different way or from another perspective. And so, I mean, it seems like problem definition is a really, because you can, I mean, it's like, I don't know, the way that we've been working a lot is the chemistry that we're using in the work that I've been doing for the last 10 years, that's not novel. I mean, it's new. It's the application that's new. Yeah. And then also the second point, which is this sort of deep and wide combination that you seem to talk about, that is you need to both have the depth, but you also need to have the width. And then either you have that in one person or you have a team, but then what you were saying, Mike, with depending on the subject, the smartest person in the room is going to shift. That's a really nice little nugget, I thought.
Yeah.
Cool. I just wanted to underline those because I
think the reframing of the problem. Yeah. I think one of the, so in our innovation process, my connection is unstable again. I'll switch to a hotspot after. You can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So I think that's something that is so often kind of in our blind spot, that the problems and the way how when we cannot solve ourselves out of a certain situation, it's very often from the frame that we're looking at things, right? So you have this cheesy Einstein quote of you can't solve a problem with the same thinking you created it. I think it's cheesy but very true.
And I didn't have to say
example,
it. It's awesome.
You didn't have to say it, yeah.
Yes, I love you.
So for example, we've been working a lot in this poverty space, and there's been, at least in Holland, so much money poured into trying to educate people out of poverty. So if you would just make this decision and just make that decision, of educating them. And then as we started working with the experts and also talking to a lot of people that are in poverty, and just bring them and to really co-creating the people that work them. And what's with which look at that problem. Government has been looking at these people as rational beings, like Homo economicus. If you just give them the information and the resources to get extra money, then we'll get it. And we saw that actually a lot of noise on the frame that we were looking that of a rational being, when actually we realized, when we started talking to these people, the legislators and the people within this system, that actually we're more of a, call it homo integralis. So we instead of just our rationale, we kind of integrate our emotions and our social context, and the amount of money we have in our wallet also influences our behavior a lot. And once we started looking at the problem like that, suddenly it opened a whole different range of solution space, basically, in a really different way than the kind of more educational approach that governments tend to take when dealing with poverty. Like it's not a case of them not understanding, or that it's just about not having the resources. Enabling people. So just an illustration.
Hey, Mayra, you are chopping up a little bit. I don't know if do you have an alternative internet that you could jump on, or like you want to, if you have an option, then maybe do that, because it sucks to miss, like, it's not super bad, but it's like every now and then. Meaning if you want to jump out of the call and jump back in again, that'd be absolutely fine. Or is it doing something better? Are you back? Is it good?
I am here.
Yes. Cool.
Sorry about that, guys.
No worries.
Wow.
No worries at all.
I think we need to expand upon. I think what I was saying is in my world, sometimes it's kind of like you run into a lot of institutionalized thinking. So like it's hard to sort of sometimes like I guess experience can be remarkably helpful, and other times it ends up into institutionalized thinking, as far as like the trigger word for us is like, this is the way we've always done it, or we used to do it this way, or like that type of institutionalized thinking are triggers to take on that, like the respect of the experience and getting the good information from people who are experienced, but then also not jumping to the solution just yet. You kind of have to approach innovation, I think, kind of like a kid a little bit, like without getting to the solution right away, but trying to figure out how do I navigate, and again, not think differently just to do that, but to look at it and question why things were done a certain way. So the questioning of experience is also quite helpful to get through the institutionalized thinking. And you see that in design quite often, like as far as designs of products that are more incrementally improved versus disruptively improved, where people look at that sort of like refinement of something and continuous improvement versus maybe sort of like a radical or disruptive idea. Mainly you get institutionalized into thinking.
Yeah. And it's really hard to see those stories, I think, of through what lens are we looking at the world, and why is the problem there at all. I think so, like everything that we use and that's created today has been created in the world of yesterday. So I always really get inspired by, okay, what does this thing say about the time in which it was designed and used, and how have the times changed, and what is that perspective with which a system was created, and what human truths are still true, and what other things are also true. I don't know if that's right. But deconstructing, I think, is really essential.
Yeah, I think that also is like in the material space where I exist, and manufacturing is the decisions that were made when people were innovative previously were the toolbox that they had available to them at that point, whether it's 30 years ago or 20 years ago. And since then, there's been an improvement of a toolbox. So people have created new processes or new equipment or new areas on how to approach manufacturing that you can use to build on that. So I think that's like one of the most exciting things about being at Tesla is that we're building new factories, which is an incredible like pleasure, because you can use technology that's available today that maybe wasn't available when people manufactured cars 30 years ago. But you get into a loop, especially in manufacturing, where you have assets that are in place that are really expensive that you want to use and continue to do it, but the process and the equipment in the factories are made to design one thing previous to that. So I think sometimes it takes sort of a approach to reset and say, okay, well, that's how they, the respect for how they did it previously, but then also what's new, or what does my toolbox look like now in that world? Yeah, that's like you get, and sometimes the way they manufacture it is exactly the way it should have been manufactured, even today and 20 years ago. It's just as it was equally as innovative and things with that one. But most often the institutionalized comes from taking a look at how things are made, and then in my world, and then making it exactly the same way. I think you run into that. You end up, it ends up being a crutch for a lot of people.
It's also interesting because when you say that, at least to me, I'm like, it, of course, like it's so obvious. And then again, like in the process of trying to market, like what I've been trying to like, it's so often that's held back. And of course it's not expressed. I mean, both of you have a very clear thinking around it. And so you're framing it in terms that makes it obvious, I think. But I mean, so like the way that I would meet it, that type of attitude is like, it's like when just a question of like, so what's the baseline? Like, what do you need to achieve in a material, and then the question, like you get the data sheet for the material that they're already using. And you're like, well, I get that this is what you're using, but like, what are the, like, where's the room? Like, where do you want to improve, and where do you have, like, because you have margin, like this isn't exactly this isn't the perfect material. It's like, there's room here. So, and like looking at that and unlocking that, and like having that mindset or that affordance or allowance within the organization also to look at that in that way. I guess also like getting to this why, like, why are we doing it this way? Like, why do we need that tensile strength? Why do we need that? Or like, why are we using money in this way? Or like, why, what is it really education that's the issue, right? It's like, will education solve the problem, or is that just, it just happened to be, is it a correlation or a causation, or like, what is it,
Yeah, that's a deep, it's a deep question. I think in some ways, like I think innovation, looking back at it, is always easy to look at, because you end up in that same thing that you had just mentioned, Emma, which is, of course, that should be the way that you do it. But when you're doing it, you're trying to do something new in something that hasn't been done before. So I think the other thing that like kind of had to inspire people to be innovative is that you should expect resistance to your idea or to your thing, because you're trying something new that's disrupting or changing the way people have done it things. So you have like kind of that reverse selling aspect to kind of define a problem without either expressing that what you're doing now is to create an inclusive world versus a defensive world is very difficult when you're doing it. That's probably my biggest struggle, because you kind of like, you end up not necessarily, but you try to, it looks so good to you, but you're trying to, like, the influencing skills and storytelling and when to bring people in and how to do that process is somewhat of an art form, and it involves more people skills than technical skills. Sometimes you can bulldoze innovation by just being remarkably smart and also have an idea that's so pure. But a lot of times, even if you're in that world, you have to be relevant, you have to engage and figure out how to express your idea, or how to sell it, if you will. But yeah, I think that's also a misnomer, is you kind of like, you should expect resistance. That's perfectly fine. It's just trying to figure out like resistance versus conflict is quite a challenge as well. It's like, how do you navigate that world? So that's it's
oh my gosh, yeah, it's such a huge challenge. Yeah, I really like, for me there was such a huge difference in working with and at startups, where that was kind of like the glorified way to work together, right? Like just being very open and quite critical on like, what are we putting out into the world, and being very bold. And then kind of switching to working for the government, what I learned was like, you cannot say you're innovative. You just should not use that word or frame yourself as like, oh yeah, we're designers and we're coming here to look things from a different angle. I think the big learning for me was really meeting people where they are, and like reading their reports and the names they give to the governance, and then making them feel like, oh, this is fitting very nicely into what we've envisioned, and helping people feel like this is a means to get there. Because I think maybe for people for whom it's not a day-to-day business, it's really hard, and it's quite scary to go there with all these, oh yeah, we're gonna shake things up, you know, especially so that's a huge challenge in working with the public space, where there's so much innovation needed.
And just to see if I can drop this in there in a way that flows, but like there's, I mean, innovation and creativity is, I think, for at least some people, it's like, there's almost like, you know, they're like the equation, like the equal sign in between. But what you're what you're getting at here is like, there's also the communication skills, and like there's also there's a lot of other stuff for like innovation, and then of course like defined as what we're saying now, like to make it usable and scalable, and like to like integrate maybe invention and impact, and that becomes innovation. Like if that's the sort of model of innovation that we're framing it in. But then I just want to like, again, like, are there other components there? So we have the creativity, like something like out of the box thinking. There is like the communication skills. And I know, I mean, Mayra, you talked about the fog last time. I don't know if you want to expand on that, but I think that's also like another important parameter there, right?
Yeah, I think that is like the biggest kind of predictor of, at least culture-wise, whether there's going to be an innovative output of a collaboration. That's why I think it's really collective imagination, because that otherwise it's just the lone inventor, right? And then I think when you're really like, you do need those different perspectives to do something that is systematically different than the kind of model that you would use before. And for that, in that space and in that kind of hard work that Mike was describing, that phase of we don't even really know what is the right question to ask, or we're still searching for the question, and we've gathered lots of data about the problem, and we feel that problem, and it's like you really want to, but you don't really know where to start, or what is an inspiring frame to look at the problem space with, and that we call the fog. So there's all this stuff around you, and you just can't see where to go. And one thing because we work so closely together with you know, the researchers, and that we take them into this process that they've never done before, they just get the scares, they get shit scared. And I really understand that, because you can't see where you're going. And I think, as Mike was saying, like some people are naturally really good at handling that ambiguity and the fog, and dealing with not knowing, and being able to say, I don't know the answer to this question, and I'm fine with that, and I can stay in that space for a little bit. And I think the way, well, some people are, you know, raised, or we don't tend to train that ability to say I don't know a lot in most educational styles, at least. So hence, in the fog, people tend to freak out, and our role as like the generalist extractors of expertise is to kind of like hold people's hands in a kind of metaphoric way, and say, this is normal, this always happens at this point, we'll get there, it's a process, trust the process. And at the outcome of it, we don't know what's going to be there, we don't know even what the right problem to solve is yet, but we've gone through the fog before, just trust us. That's at least our reality. How's it for you, Mike?
I think I love the sort of the analogy of fog, because it creates that sort of like, it creates some place where you're not able to see where you're going necessarily. And I know on my team, like, I think the big sort of differentiator that I've seen in different teams that I've worked for is and worked with, because I've had the sort of the pleasure to sort of go work with multiple different teams across both at Apple and Tesla, and previous work that I did before Apple. And the sort of like, I guess when you're in a business world, when you're being paid to deliver something, or not necessarily just this sort of isolated creative that you were talking about, Mayra, is the sort of safety space that it's okay to fail. It's okay to say things like, in creating team dynamics and a team structure that there's an emotional safety to be vulnerable within.
How was it after
space.
the class? How was that day?
Oh yeah, I mean, it was crazy. It's like I'm kind of a living example of, you know, and being on that edge, because you don't know where the safe edge is. I mean, I got as close to the safe edge as possible that anyone could ever imagine, going viral, being, you know, the day of, and went through all the emotions, the things, and kind of also, I can coach it, but living it was different than coaching it, I think is probably the best way I would explain it. But when I came out of the failure, and people still to this day, even though it was 6 months ago, is come to me and say, like, you know, wow, you're still here, like you're still things. And I fortunately, you know, work for a leader who's you know, who a risk taker, but also there's also a little bit of some trust there, and some background and details that were things. And I think that's sort of the difference between a failure and a mistake, is like your ability to feel safe to try something that was calculated and tested and things, but it's still risky. But it's okay to go through that calculation. A mistake is someplace where you look back and say, either I would, or, you know, not necessarily would you do something differently, but would you approach it the same way? Would you have done all the same moves beforehand? And looking back, I think that, you know, the one sort of mistake that I would have after the glass failure of Cybertruck was not sort of bringing my team back together and having like a group, like, hey, we're okay. Like, we did it on like 4 or 5 things, but I'm okay, we're okay. But like, this is fine. Like that type of sort of like what some of my friends call like kind of an after action report. So things happened, you get together, you just talk about it. Go around the room. What did you do? What did that do? And you get it out. I didn't necessarily do that because I was caught up in full on, and like I couldn't be, if it would happen to somebody under me, I would have been able to objectively gather the group together and go do that, because it's important.
And then it happens to you.
Then it happened to me, and you didn't have that safety person above you to be like, you know, the dad in the room, or the mom in the room, or the adult to say like it's okay, or the Mayra to say like, this is how.
Elon didn't come to you to give you a hug and say it's okay.
we did run into each other, but it was like, no, but that's exactly what happened. What happened to me, honestly, it's like it's exactly what happened to me. We traded some notes, and and I have an email from Elon saying exactly that. Like, nice. You know, like sometimes it happens. So I was able to get that, like kind of get safety. That hug, if you will, and the safety. So I think that's I think if you, as you're defining teams and you're defining like how to do innovation, it's creating a space and a culture that's okay with falling flat on your face, getting back up and dusting off and learning from what you did before. But that's a unique culture, and it's not taught within, you know, it's in like, whether if you're in artist or a creative world, but in engineering and things, and in design, it has that perspective. But the challenge is to you have to put yourself in the room where decisions are being made to have an impact. I think that's also something that is a bit, because it's easy to be everyone can be the creative outside the box, like their own person, their own thoughts, you know, the inventor or the artist who creates on their own, solely on your own, who defines their own path and things. But in our world of innovation, in my world of innovation inside corporate Americas, you have to have all those pieces you mentioned on it, but also you have to position yourself in the room where decisions are being made. That's the challenge, and that comes with, you have to understand the balance of when it's right to do new stuff, when it's not right to do stuff, when there's like, where in the program are you going to intersect your technology thing. So if you're too late in the program and decisions are made and tools are already kicked off, and you know that you're already producing it, you can't come in with a brand new idea and a disruptive idea to the executive. Early on in the design cycle, you can figure out how do you approach it. And it's not that you can't do innovation with a sustaining program. You can absolutely do that. You can make things cheaper and more affordable and refine it and get the quality. Like there's innovation in that cycle. But to be, you know, if you're coming in as a creative in this world and doing innovation, you have to know the tact of how to behave within a product life cycle and a product performance. And that's a challenge for a lot of creatives, because they come in and they want to do brand new ideas and move things around, and that's okay early on. But in like later on in a product life cycle, you kind of become that, you exit yourself from the room, because they're like, all right, we have to make decisions. We're not going to be doing new stuff. But you got to figure out how do you position yourself within a decision to make an impact. That would be the distinction I would make between creative and innovation. Innovation comes with creative ideas, but also an impact into the world. And to do that, sometimes it's not only the most creative idea, but the creative idea at the right time, in the right product portfolio, that feedback.
Super. I'm also like, what pops up for me in that is also like this, how do you drive a change process? And there's a complexity person called Nora Bateson who talks a lot about like, how do you drive change? And to do that, you need to hold paradox. So it means you both have to be really good at, the whatever is ongoing, like the day-to-day stuff, and being able to, like, I guess, if you will, in this context, you probably like find the language, and again, like find the right supporters, and like know how to leverage the different parts of the organization to get like position yourself, I guess, and then also be able to have that other part, like the innovative part, the outside of the box, the sort of the new way of thinking, or like that creative ability. And then when both those come together in a nice way, then you have at least a space where innovation could happen, in theory.
Yeah. And I think that what Mayra was mentioning is around the process. I'd love to hear more about that, because the process, there is some rigor behind innovation and creative thought and creative thing. And in my viewpoint, especially on the engineering side, is that I feel like it's as much of a skill as somebody who does sort of mechanical engineering in my world, or electrical engineering, where it's very rigorous. There is an approach and an attitude that, because you can do it poorly, like anything in the world. You can do new stuff and do it really poorly, or do it very well. And in my experience, like there's not necessarily a rule book, but there's a process and an ability to follow it. And for me, just my viewpoint is I spend a ton of time on having a fair measurement system early on in my stuff. So you're agnostic of the answer, but you create rigorous data that if you look back at it, or somebody challenges it, that you're able to defend it, and to be able to say, like, here was the approach, this is how I did it. Also, if you're going to fail and take stuff out of if you're going to down select, so if you're going to remove ideas or remove materials in my world, that you would want to look back and say, well, this is why I made that decision. Here's the process, versus just sort of like going it and you get a sense or a gut feel that that's the right way to go. That's also my struggle, is I'll look at it and be like, yep, that's the right way to go. But you'll have to come back and say, like, did I do all the right things to be able to look backwards and defend that I down selected to this material or this process.
Exactly. I think in our process, it's of course not material design. It's the like more fluffy side of design maybe, but I think we very similarly, our first phase is really that constructing of a frame, right? And in that frame of so if we look at the world this way, what is the world we want to create? So we kind of take a step back and think, okay, so if the world is changing and there's these human principles that will still be true, but there's these new technologies. If we design something today that will be out into the world in 5 years, what is our view of that world? What do we want to create? And then we really refine, like, first completely the statement of what we want to achieve in users and by what mechanism. And then any kind of solution, and that's a very rigorous kind of way, and I think that's where you can also kind of see, you can measure then good solutions from not so good solutions, because you have this way of measuring, okay, will this impact, does this adhere to those you're basically designing rulers all the time. Like, will it do that? And that you can test in human behavior, really dissect it and be very critical. Like, okay, why would this fail? And then really start there. And that's a very rigorous process of, okay, I think there's in the space of innovation, especially in the social space of innovation, there's really a huge pitfall of just asking people like, do you like this? And I think in if we,
why is that a pitfall?
tying it, because people will tell you anything to be liked. So they'll give you answers like, oh yes, Mayra, this thing you came up with, magical, so great. And my ego will go like, yes, somebody likes it, okay, I need to pursue. And then people will tell you anything. Sometimes also it's the complete different way around. Like they'll tell you, I was working at the startup called Peerby, and it's this platform with which you can share things with your neighbors. And we were trying out a business model, and that was like, ooh, they're trying out a business, because it was like this darling startup in the Netherlands, and everyone was using it, and they were just borrowing and lending. And then this guy told me, like, literally, like, why are you doing this? I'll never use this. You guys suck for doing this. So the complete different side. And we just started doing it anyway, because we really believe that, okay, if we actually make it really easy for people to like order things that are maybe their neighbors, and we just, we give them a lot of transparency, and it becomes as easy as walking to the shop and buying something yourself, then we believe that people will use it. And that same person that told me like, Mayra, I will never use this new service sucks. You didn't say it that way. It just felt that way, for my ego. And then that same guy was like one of the first super users that started using it. Like every 2 weeks, he would think like, oh, this is actually now something that it suddenly got into like his choice architecture in his head, and he just, people are very bad at predicting their own behavior. So it's a really hard thing to measure whether people are going to buy or sell, or there's no better way than just getting it out there and at least test it with real behavioral data.
Sorry, I'm sorry that I'm cutting you in, but I'm also like, it's super interesting. I'm also thinking like in that context, it feels perfect to drop in sustainability as another frame here. Like, where does it stand in like innovation? And like, I guess also, I mean, the choice architecture, I guess, is like, the preferred choice. Like, how do you square those circles? Like with new versus sustainable, or where are they in relationship to each other?
Right. Yeah, I think on product, like in a product design world, or like when you're starting in a new product, I kind of explain it like kind of who has a seat at the table. Like, who has a seat at the table of cost is always at the table, time is always at the table. Usually technology performance or some level of performance is at the table, and there's trade-offs between, there's some great sort of graphics of like scope, time, and performance of something. And in my experience is sort of, and those trade-offs are important, because typically not the best technical solution always ends up on the product. It's the best technical solution at the right time with the right cost. So the balance of all those trade-offs. If I was sort of running sustainability at a company, I would make sure that this sort of performance is ingrained in sustainability. So you could do a proper trade-off between cost and time and sustainability, I think, and performance, if you will. Like, there's a bunch of very sustainable materials out there that don't perform to the level of requirements for products, and that's likely why they're not, like, if they would perform at the right cost and time, it wouldn't just be sustainability gets them in, it would be a performance aspect. But how do you balance those attributes? And if you're just doing sustainability, then you're out here without any of those other attributes like time, cost, and performance that can craft a product. So the challenge is there, like, to get into the room with saying like, okay, how do we define performance, and sustainability being part of that world? But that's sort of the hard work about finding like a very sustainable, maybe what you're doing with Amit, where you find an amazing sustainability that works, but then as you bring it back into the mix, it's not sort of like whatever those other constraints are that the products or the materials are doing, is to understand those constraints and how to intersect it is things. But yeah, I think it's the more sort of it gets intertwined into the world, which it seems like it's going that direction, the more engineers and materials people and things will have that as part of their trade-off analysis to really drive it. Because it might be that you may want more sustainable at a higher cost, but those are sort of like hard decisions to make. Or equally, in my world, more difficult is to move out a time frame because of a sustainable option is not ready at the time that you need to launch a product. Time for us tends to be the biggest driver for down selection of stuff. Yeah. Yeah, and that was the same at when I was at Apple and product companies. Is there hasn't been one product I've worked on where you're truly happy with the result. There's always, if I had a little more time or a little more money or a little more cost, I could have improved it a bit more. And the balance of getting on a roadmap of improving that product and getting ready. So, okay, I didn't get it in this product, but I'll be ready next time and sharpen my pencil and get a better story or work on industrialization of it so it's ready at the time for that next product. But that's also sort of maybe from the outside looking in that it's confusing for people who are not in the mix every day of like, why didn't you make this decision for that product? And you have to go back and we made that decision 2 years ago because we had to scale that thing up. Now in 2 years we'll be working on another product that's different than that.
Cool.
And I think one thing that makes it so complex, right, within the sustainability space is that, and I think this is also a reason why we held off on really choosing more sustainable products, is because we think right now we can be quite stuck in the rhetoric of just paper straws or like these things that are very easy to see and to understand. And then the complexity of the real effects of every decision. I would want it to be as clear as, how far we've come in our knowledge of what foods to drink or the ingredients there, right? I would love for us to have the same kind of source of truth, if you may, in what decisions can you make as a consumer that have certain impact. So I think our role as designers is to make it as easy as possible for people to act in line with their values, because I think definitely at this point, so many people have that want and that need, and they kind of feel they don't know where to put that energy into. And so I think there's a lot of really beautiful steps happening, and then I think where the biggest impact is being made or could be made in sustainability wise. It might also sometimes be just not buying something, not doing something, and that is just within the mindset of buying of consumers. Now I'm going to sound like a socialist again, Mike. No, I think that's a business model as well, right? It's not always about producing something new, and I think that's where meaning really comes in. And I think, for example, that's where Tesla really nails it. It's like you're not really you're buying the product, and you're also buying kind of like a transformation, being part of the movement. And I think that's a really interesting new economy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Meaning.
Yeah, and I think there's also sort of like how you I think the consumers defining sustainability is really important as well. So you look like versus engineers or product people. Like give you an example in the materials world, like when there's sort of biodegradable materials that are out there. From what I get paid to do is make things not biodegradable. I make things that last a long time, that look pretty, that perform. So there's an opposite interaction between my core, from a product perspective, my core job and why I'm employed is to make things last longer, make them pretty, make them durable, make them chemically resistant.
Don't make them biodegradable, please.
Yeah. So you make them biodegradable, and it changes changes the sort of the mindset of around what to do. So like that's just because biodegradable it sounds like, of course that's the way you do it. And maybe there are products that are out there, but there's definitely products like soup spoons and other things and garbage bags and things that don't perform as well as the incumbent thing, as for people saying. So you're asking the consumer then to make to trade performance for things. And a lot of times that works. Like packaging is a good example, that there's amazing packagings out there and things that are shipped around that are sustainable, and they need to perform just in their little bit of lifetime that's out there. Things. So I think it's also picking the right, for sustainability, it's picking the right aspect of what you want to make and how you want to define that things. There's clear, or like reframing it, that if you make products last much longer, people don't need to replace them as much over, and that could be equally, if not more. So you could have a better product that performs better, that doesn't get replaced as often. That's also like an approach to, maybe an education approach to sustainability as well.
I really like that, I think. And then, but what came up for me, because I drew your little table there, like what kind of gets to sit around the table. And then I wrote sustainability as like on one of the seats. And then I was like, hell, like, why isn't it just part of performance?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And it's like another performance metric that we also have to sort of gather data around and create data around, and then we can
100%.
And then also what you're saying, like Mayra, with the complexity. I mean, I think about complexity, like it seems with complexity is like you seem to have like two poles that you can either draw in this way or in that way. And then you have some sort of like attractor, like action going on, or like it might be more things on there. And then like around that, it's kind of like organizes itself. So I think exactly what you're pointing to now, Mike, that's so like exactly the way that I'm feeling into it as well, is that you have, there's so many parameters that you could be highlighting when you are talking about sustainability. And so is it, is the only thing we care about carbon dioxide, is the only thing we care about is water, or, biodiversity, or, how do you, it's such a big topic in a sense. And so, I just wanted to like throw that out there. It's an optimization problem as well.
It is. No, you're exactly right. It's an optimization problem. I think also in looking at products, you may not sort of, like, people might kind of get exposed unless you're part of product design teams, that no one is ever happy. So there's a battle between compromise for, like, I'll give you aesthetics as an example. Designers tend to like really bright white things that are out there, like, so a bright white material. Then there's the reliability where it fades in UV or does any sort of doesn't perform in that world. So there's a balance between, and you got it, like there's sort of like it's not necessarily resistance, but it's this compromise of optimization. What's the best product? Best product's not something that's beautifully white that fades over time. So you end up, what ends up happening is the designers take a little bit reduction in chroma or whiteness, and to aid in UV resistance or chemical resistance in the product. And sustainability, I would say, just talk about like part of performance is you put that person, he or she, within that matrix, and you would have something like post-consumer recycle as a metric in there. So how much post-consumer recycle PET bottles come into this equation, and that may affect the UV resistance, the color, and the mechanical performance and the things. But you want to get into that loop of trading those compromises, because your ability to impact may be that you got 10 or 15% post-consumer recycle into that product versus 100%, which you're out there which he or he is out there developing. But to get 15%, you made that impact into the product that scaled up and went to mass production. And that's a win, but you shouldn't necessarily, that person wouldn't necessarily feel happy about it, but you're in the fight, if you will, or you're in the game. So I think in sustainability, you can't do it from the stands. You have to be on the field playing the game. And I would say in general, sometimes that it's not a spectator sport. You want to engulf yourself in that world and make yourself relevant into that space. And that's where the work comes in. You got to run the compromises or be part of the performance matrix of that world. So even inside those little performance things, there's other triangles, which then start to figure out, like, how do you define performance of that world? But the large one tends to be scope, cost, and performance is sort of that large triangle.
And how does it come into play in your world, how people interact with it? Because I think what you were just touching on, so like how long do people keep a car for example, or use a phone for, and that kind of sustainability. I think, so in my work, I would always take human behavior as one of these parameters, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Definitely.
Is that part of performance then?
It is. I think I would probably about 5 years ago, I would have explained sustainability as like a check mark afterwards, like kind of a plus, like a plus on a product. So you have all the products, and by the way, it's sustainable, so it has a check mark to it, versus intertwined into the main belief of like into the product development cycle. And that could just be time, it could be scale, it could be like from a scale perspective. There's a lot of great materials out there that aren't at the scale that from a manufacturing or from a supply perspective. So even though it's an amazing material, you'd have to make more of it. Like say, as an example, like ocean plastics or something like that. Like the supply of it versus the like what you're manufacturing is also a good sort of like, you know, if you look at the sneaker industry, they're able to put out a smaller volume run of a certain config and then scale that up over time. And I would say in my world, like there's a lot of choices out there. I think it's getting more earlier on in sort of the design thinking of materials. Absolutely. And whether it's renewable or sustainable or any of those things, that more of that discussion is coming up.
Yeah, even I think a lot of it at the very beginning of a product life cycle, when we're creating a new service or innovating in some space, I think true sustainability is actually something a lot of people value. And so how do you make it as easy as possible for people to act in line with those values? And I think that is what...
and also what you were saying, Mayra. Sorry, go ahead, finish up. Finish.
That's something that I think now brands are awakened to, like, but still, how do you make that true and not a greenwashing thing, even though people love to be seen with it, and so therefore these very visual things are, you know, working well. How can we go deeper?
I just thinking about what you were saying. I'm going to do two things in this. I'm just going to like make a statement and then like open up as well for everybody to join in the discussion, because like we've hit the hour. One thing that you mentioned with that like just kind of shook me a little bit, or like it popped something open in my head, was this like the human aspect of it. So it's like, you know, in theory, like in my prejudice was like, I was thinking about it in terms of cars, of course, now, but it's like, of course it's better if cars always last longer. But then I'm like, hold on a second, you know, or like if I look at my phone, you know, it's better if it always lasts longer in a sense. But then I'm like, well, you know, like all of my friends switch phones every 2 or 3 years anyways. So like, what's the point then in putting materials in there that are lasting for 10 or 15 or an eternity?
Right. Right.
I thought that was just provoking, and it's like it opened something up. Like you definitely use like biodegradable stuff that would like disintegrate with, you know, the watch, like the performance watch that would disintegrate with sweat, so like you don't have it anymore after you've done your right amount of workouts, and then you're healthy. You know, something like that. No, but jokes aside, no, but I think there's more to that, and I think it's not as trivial. It's easy to say like, yeah, of course, like how people use them, but there's something like clicked into place for me at least. But, we've had some questions in the chat, and Melke, I don't know if you want to lead off with some reflections or something like that, just to open up the floor, let people know that it's okay to speak.
Yeah, for sure. My mind is kind of up here in a fog, if you will. I'm thinking about I'm trying to frame this as well. How to innovate in a future-proof way. That you were speaking about people in the past innovating with a toolbox of the past, and right now you guys are innovating with the toolbox of now. But what if you could make this the ruler that you're designing have a future-proof mechanism or a metric that so when that in 10 years you look back at the product, you say that, okay, I recognize that they had these tools, but they still made it possible for us to iterate upon the tools that they had. But you get where I'm going?
yeah, so hopefully in the future they'll look back at the things that we design now, and they'll see that things were created in a more modular way, so you don't have to throw away the whole thing, or like self-learning like Tesla cars.
And I think some of it happens like in my approach. I tend, we don't necessarily have time for like kind of what I would call pure invention, because the time scale of our product launches tends to be too quick. So, and no one's clairvoyant or smart enough to say that exactly, but there's researchers who look at the problem and say, you know, people who are on research, and they take it and they do some core fundamental invention research that's not driven by a product schedule, that's driven by pure technology development. And she or he is development for the future. It's like there's researchers are incredibly important to do core research to figure out how to do invention, so you're able to truly disrupt this space, or something that's like kind of game breaking, so like whether it's in skunkworks or moonshot programs that are completely sort of undefined but highly technical. Grayson would have got, yeah. But that's sort of like, I think that in a sense sort of like kind of doesn't future proof it, but keeps you on a development cycle, keeps you on a product and improvement cycle and technology roadmap. But sometimes innovation comes with just taking something from a different industry and applying it to your space. So that's primarily what my industry, we took architectural technologies from architectural and applied them to automotive, which became innovative on its own from size and shape and complexity. So that's also something that's sort of like, you know, innovation can have a whole bunch of different worlds in that world. Yeah.
Thank you for that answer. May I take one more, Amit?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm also interested to hear what you have to say about the Jevons paradox. Are you familiar with it? It's regarding absolute versus relative decoupling, so that when you innovate for sustainability, if we take the energy sector as an example, that when you make something more energy efficient, people tend to use it more. So if cars become more sustainable, people could drive more, or if planes were more sustainable, people would fly more, and the overall consumption of energy would go up because of that paradox. Do you have any thoughts on that in regards to innovation?
So, yeah, I'm not familiar with the paradox. I'd say that like kind of as like, it is something sort of like you would want to think about from a use of a product, of how it's going to be used. But sometimes it's like how people use things is like you wouldn't be able to necessarily predict that. I don't think. But I think as you look at like understanding sustainability, and in my world, it would come from more of like kind of defining it, not necessarily on like the product level, but being able to quantify it in a way of like, what does it mean to be sustainable? What does it mean to do it? Like, is it energy usage for a product? Is it transportation or transport of it? But yeah, if people like, I mean, from my perspective, that's sort of the goal, is to make people use more of what we're making. So I would say that we'd be aligned with that, and like aligned with the things. I wouldn't spend much time in my thought process of which we're so, I wouldn't say in the weeds, but so focused on the next product and doing it correctly and making things that it's less think tanky, if you will, than that. Like I won't spend much space in like the future or necessarily the past, but just being somewhat laser focused on what we need to do to accomplish our next task, and then move on. So it's a bit simpler behind the scenes than like in the future, I would say. Like I'm more of a nuts and bolts type of guy. Yeah.
Just to throw my 5 cents in there as well, is like the way that I see it is like there are different jobs to be done by like different actors, I think. And you probably have, you know, like a product company, I mean, like Tesla like now, but I mean, I also know that like IKEA and like that have an insight into like what we do, like what they do really well is scaling stuff. Like we're really good at scaling. Like once it's at this level, we can bring it to the market, like, you know, And so I know that like IKEA are doing, I mean, they're also doing like, you know, investment opportunities, like stuff like that. And so like they can frame a problem and say like, okay, we know that this is right. It'd be nice if it was out there. And then like that goes out as like a call of open innovation. And then like innovations come back and they will screen through them and then they will scale them. And like when they put their machinery through, like nobody can do it like that in a sense. And I think, you know, it kind of probably ends up in the, I'm thinking in context of the question, Melke, is like, if you have, I mean, now you have a lot of car companies starting to do services instead of products, right? So you have Volvo doing, you get access to a Volvo car. And so you share, it's like a carpool, but from the manufacturer instead. So like it's a business model shift and you're incorporating the use. And so then it doesn't, so like to add to the same paradox that like you make it more efficient. So the use goes up. And so that like that would sort of equate, or like that you're still at the same or at a worse paradigm. But then you could also think that if we pick in materials into that, then maybe we're not, it might mean that we're using fewer cars, and then by that, you know, saving resources, I guess. Energy is consumption as it goes, so that's different. But maybe
just a little, maybe a little tidbit as we're sort of brainstorming, talking out loud, is most cars in the world spend at least over 90% of their time parked. So doing nothing. They just hang out and parked in the thing. So, you know, part of the sort of like that idea, that paradox is like, there's not a lot of products that are that sort of emotional that end up in such a big purchase for people, that it's amazing to watch the data that they spend a lot of their time just sitting in garages overnight or sitting at workplaces for 8 hours a day, and they do very limited work for what they're designed to do. So I think that's also like an interesting one, if you're able to solve some of that, whether it's ride sharing or autonomy or making them like last. For us, like as a materials person behind the scenes, you look at like how well your tires do, or how well brakes do, or inside or outside, like the interior vehicles, that a car may last 10 years, but it's only been driven, you know, out of those 10 years, less than a few months of driving in that time frame. So it's an interesting thing. Like as far as the use cases go up, for me, that's sort of like what drives my thinking on my team, is you'd actually have to increase durability by the amount of more that this thing's going to be on the. So immediately it sort of triggers in like, okay, that's going to be sort of a paradigm shift coming up, like in the future. But what do we need to do? Like if we stay with what we currently have, we might wear out a seat way quicker than we're going to be doing it in the future. And you got to solve that problem before you launch the product, before you put it on the thing. So it's sort of like it's an interesting one to sort of like keep in your mind from product perspective.
Mayra, I'd love to hear, because you had the experience with the tools, the rental platform as well. Like, I mean, doesn't it relate?
For household items, it really came from that vision actually of Anna, my co-founder. She was graduating in the topic of sustainability, and her kind of conclusion was actually the most sustainable thing is just to produce less stuff and to own less stuff. And how can we enable people to share instead of own? So then she met this really awesome guy, Dan, and he had just lost his house because it burned down. And he also lost his, had just broken up with his girlfriend, and he had this experience where lots of random people were helping him out with different things. And as he had that experience, this kind of universal truth came up that, hey, actually, people are generally really good and they are generally willing to share. And as I said, I think as a designer, or as at least what we've committed to at Inc. is designing things that make it easier for people to act in line with those values. And the really interesting thing in working with Peerby is that that's the name of the platform. It's now like the world's largest sharing platform. It's really it's fun. It was a little bit ahead of its time. It's existed, I think, now for like 5 years or so, and people were like, wait, why would people want to do that? And everyone was like asking us, like, isn't it just filled with people that hack the system and borrow things of people just to never return them ever? And the funny thing was that there were way more people on that platform that wanted to share lend than actually that felt safe enough to borrow something. And it has to do with that kind of choice architecture, not knowing what's going to happen if you just ask it on this platform. So we could be really, really clear, like, the data shows that anytime you ask for a drill in this neighborhood, you'll have a drill within 30 minutes from one of your neighbors within the circle of 2 kilometers. That's what the data showed. But still, just the lack of process transparency and like, oh, what kind of person is going to give that to me and what kind of drill is going to be. That made it scary for people and that caused the platform to have much more people that were really enthusiastic to share and lend and and their things. And the most hard thing to get to was actually, how do you get people to ask for things and to not buy and borrow? That was a really beautiful kind of like, wow. Okay, so the lending, getting people to share, was not the problem we needed to focus on. It's like, how do you get people comfortable enough to step out of like the default way? If you need something, you go buy it, and use this platform and get into that choice architecture.
I also wanted to throw out one to Nils, if you are there. You wrote one in the chat a while back. Do you want to ask it yourself? Maybe not. I can read it.
Yeah.
Otherwise. I'll read it. He said, how can we inspire and educate the general public to do more innovation work? Sensing innovation only happening in corporate context is not sufficient to drive enough change or to birth a full regenerative society. What's your take? The education perspective.
So I think the first thing that comes into my mind is this psychological safety that we've been talking about. So that is, I did like an education, one of my first companies was, I wanted to disrupt educational system, and I started a program. It was called the Do-It-Yourself class, and it was like kind of like merging like design thinking and the startup, and basically just getting kids to think about societal issues and then drop that seed in, like, oh, actually you can create things to innovate yourself out of this. And it was a really hard paradox for me to be in, because I was in school and the kids would just ask me, like, what do I do to pass this program and to get a good result? And that safety and that kind of unlearning of, actually, there's no right and wrong. Well, there's a process, and there's, you can get good results, but there's no single ruler that we can use for all of the solutions. And that lack of frame is scary for people if we constantly give people lots of frames, and if that is your source of safety. If you can't give people a source of safety from the frame that they're held by in the story, you need to create that safety in relationships, I think, like in having that culture where you're allowed to fail and where you're allowed to come up with weird things.
And I'd also say, I think that's exactly, I think that psychological safety is remarkably important. In addition to, so as I've sort of hired people and grown teams, I'm so comfortable being self-motivated and living in the fog that I don't realize that there's some people who are not comfortable being self-motivated and living in the fog. And that's okay. Same way that I would be a terrible quality engineer. Terrible. Like if it came to yield and I had to improve it, I would get bored, and if I could see it too clearly, I wouldn't do a great job at that. Not saying I wouldn't be able to do it, but it wouldn't be great. But I think it's also like innovation, in sense, it's a sexy word. It sounds great from the outside in, it looks amazing. However, I've seen people who it's very difficult for them to be self-motivated. So identification of who's good in that space and who performs, being self-motivated and having in a sort of ambiguous challenge. So I've been surprised. I've seen people that, have no background in engineering who get an ambiguous challenge and they thrive and they go and they're self-motivated and they grab things. I've also seen people who on paper, on their resume, look remarkably good, who've done terribly at this self-motivated thing. So that's my challenge. Like, how do you identify the people who are comfortable in their own skin, doing their own thing, able to get constructive feedback, but continue to be motivated towards failing, getting back up and going and doing things. Not that I'm the best at it, but I know enough that I'm comfortable in that space. So that's my first step of why I fit myself within that. I think I've been fortunate to do so. So I would also say that trying to make people feel okay about, like, if you end up in a position where you're not thriving because the motivation is different, is how to get out of that. Like if I was told by my manager exactly what to do, that would not last long for me. I wouldn't have the freedom to be creative thought and to go after it. In the same way, though, that some people really like that. They like coming to work and having a very clear structure to their thing. And there's different people in the world. It's taken me quite a while to figure that one out. Like, and people are good at innovation and people who are not so good at it. So that's sort of like a challenge, is finding the right people to do the right amount of work. And I also think, what I struggle with, and a lot of people in California, is like, as far as the tech industry or the thing is there's a lot of cool ideas, but you get comfortable within a company to go do something and start something up and go do things, that there's somewhat of a culture of entrepreneurship. However, like truly going to do something new and like taking that leap is also sometimes can be a very uncomfortable situation. How do you go try to take on an industry that's so new when you have other responsibilities around the world, where it's not only just about, so how do you balance like doing something new? And I have huge respect for trying to go and start something up that's things that I've lived within big corporate cultures for a while. Yeah.
And then I think, just to also, I kind of have to, and now I'm going to sound really socialist again, but I think social class really, really impacts we know it's as a scientific fact that only if you have the security of maybe a system that will take care of you, or a job, or a family that will take care of you if you lose everything, that hugely impacts the bandwidth. So like having limited financial resources has the same impact on your cognitive capabilities, and like calculating, and especially creative tasks, as losing a full night of sleep. So it's like, if you're worried about paying your bills at the end of the night, I think that's why I really believe in these ideas like basic income and stuff like that. We need to experiment with it, because if people don't have that, we have enough in the world. If people wouldn't have the end of the month to worry about, that creates a sense of security that I think a lot of innovation and creativity can come from.
I agree. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sort of to build on that, I think kind of an answer is what you said, Mayra, and I think the Netherlands, for example, and Sweden as well, prove great examples for the world in terms of education, because higher education is free, and in Sweden you even get money. And I don't remember exactly what it was like in the Netherlands, but it's kind of similar. And I think that is a great way as well to inspire younger people to stay in school and to be able to think about these bigger questions.
Yeah.
Sort of relating to the paradox that Malcolm mentioned before. It's like, it's very hard for people that are very smart and employed to think about those things, because as you said, Mike, it's like you already have to focus on your stuff, and that stuff is kind of equally important, because Tesla, for example, is proving to be like a great inspiration for a lot of people. And in that sense, that job is also important, but also to think about these things is also very important. And that, in that sense, as it is right now, it has to be like state funded or it has to be like 29K, for example, like philanthropy, and hopefully like very, very wealthy and fortunate people can put some money aside to sponsor like bigger thoughts.
Sure. Yeah.
I just wanted to also presence that, I mean, what we've been talking about today is a lot about sort of holding uncertainty and living in uncertainty and like, and that whole space. And so, and as both of you have pointed out, like there's a method to the madness. It's not just, you know, it's not just, you just don't go out there and like get ideas, or like there is a structure, there's a process, there are methods, there are like railings. I had the vision when you talked about the fog the first time, that you like, I'm in the fog and then I'm like reaching out my hand and I can't even see my hand, like I'm holding on to something, so I'm feeling comfortable, but I don't know what I'm holding on to. And
like
so there is yeah, exactly, but there is something there. And so I think, I mean, as far as education goes, I think there's something to that shift from
giving you
stuff,
lots
like
of
from
experiences. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's what, and I think in contrast to that, right now we're getting a lot of experiences in education where the correct answer is A, B, C, or D. And I would always think that there's so many truths, and there's something to say for all these perspectives. And I think we are actually letting kids practice very often to just stay in the frame. Yeah. Then you're safe, then you'll do good, then you'll get good grades. And I think how education should be is actually letting kids have that, go through the fog as many times as possible.
Right.
So that because it is something, I think what Mike said, like it's a bit of a trait, but it's also really a skill.
Yeah, you can train, because if you that's what I was, sorry, I just wanted to, one more like image that I wanted to just share in that. It's like like if it's the first time you're in fog, like if you're in actual fog, that's really scary, because you don't know anything and it's quiet and it's like, you know, you don't see anything and like you're stumbling around, and like once you've done it a couple of times and like you've navigated, you know how to work with your compass and you know how to work with them, like you have your tools, you know how to do that. It's a completely different thing. And so it goes also for like the picture that you're painting. Sorry, Mike, I cut it.
Oh no, that's a great, I was gonna say something like, I had the same thought. In addition, I think like that, maybe I've been fortunate things, but like I've also what differentiates a lot of people within innovation spaces, sort of like I've had a great education at Apple. I got a great education at GE. I think I wasn't within a university, but I was probably of one of the best design schools you could ever be a part of at Apple, like sitting with some of the best designers in the world and getting engulfed with like, but I also approached it in like, hey, I want to learn something different. I want to like be curious, go do something. And that, like, I think the education system, especially in the US and probably actually globally, if I've worked with enough people globally, this is somewhat of a blanket statement on this, but that you end your learning curve right after you graduate. You get your, and that is like completely, I mean, I've like, it's also like, that's the world I grew up in when I started my career. It's where did you go to school? And that had a big things. And being at product companies, and you'll hear a lot of the executives say exactly this, is like, no one asks that question. It's you show up, it gets you in the door, and they're important as far as grades and resumes. But once you're inside the door, it's a performance sport. It's a contact sport that you have to perform at. And if you don't perform, you don't get the pleasure to work at that company and to learn. And I think the thirst for learning is also something that is taught to like kind of, it's used up too early on in somebody's life. Like you use up this thirst for learning. I didn't do that great in school, but I also approached life afterwards like, hey, I just want to keep chipping away and keep learning on the way. That skills also, like, either companies or people don't find that sort of like, you get a job and then you get other responsibilities and you start going. Like I've been very fortunate where my job and learning has been both intertwined, and I'm somewhat paid to continue to do so, continue to try to figure out what, like, research things, go look at things, read, like kind of do that work and continue to learn. Yeah. So I still think I
think that's also really what differentiates.
I hope I'm
no, it makes a lot of sense. I think that's really what differentiates great companies from good companies at this point, is how well are you able to facilitate this learning culture in your company, enable your people to grow in different ways. That's what I thought was so interesting with working at 29K, that we would have like really big companies coming to us like, oh, can I use this for my, can I buy like a course so that my employees can talk about their values to their seniors, and it was like, no, there's no business model. Stay away with your money. Like we're making this for the masses. But it was great to see that the shift is kind of there, and or that companies or organizations are really taking that opportunity. But I would really love for the public education system to prepare for that, to jumpstart that, so that you can just learn how to learn as much as possible from every situation.
Yeah, and also that self-motivation thing. I mean, that's also like been studied quite a bit. And like you can buy, depending on like how you give feedback and how you assess, you know, how like you motivate different frames of like developing that skill. It's partly also a skill of like self-motivating. And so if you're used to being told, oh, you're so good, like, you know, if you get that like very straight, like the same thing, like it's right or wrong, like there's no like, you know, there's no tension, or like there's no like you need to optimize for, or like you did really good in these 3 parts, but this was not so good, like, and there's something there that one could also get to practice more, and I don't know, I think it's
also design like a more flexible context, right? Because we know what motivates people, and I don't really believe that there's such a thing as motivated or self-motivated people, but I think that right now the more self-motivated people we see have been able to deal with the context, the content was better suited to their way of learning or their way of you know, being motivated. But I don't think our workplaces and our educational system have been designed in a quite industrial mindset, when that was still like the frame, and we would, you know, have to get as many people a diploma as possible and to have all this knowledge. And I think in this kind of more post-industrial era, I think we can see that lots of people learn in lots of different ways, and like these 3 things that we know that people need for motivation, like what is it? Mastery, connectedness, and purpose. We can design the thing, like, for example, mastery is like you're motivated if you're feeling you're getting better at something and you can grasp it. But if we design this education system that is like only working for a very small amount of people get unmotivated, and it's not because they are that way, but it's because the system doesn't bring out the best in them.
Pass, you have your hand up in the chat. Do you wanna jump in? You can't be so organized. Just jump in.
Yeah, but the conversation was flowing so beautifully that what I had to come with was not exactly on that wave. So I waited a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I was kind of thinking of the human part of the creative, innovative process when you are in a very, somebody wrote in the chat a question about that, when you have the stress of the process and you have everybody's working like in a very tight team and very high performing, but then we're still human beings with the emotional part of us. And you mentioned before, Michael, the feedback part, or if you have a tragedy at home, or you get kind of sick or anything like that, you know, and of course you can always replace people like that and all that, but if we're thinking in a sustainable way, I was just wondering how, I mean, internally sustainable and collective sustainable and productive sustainable, how do you have any kind of special philosophy on when it comes to feedback, when it comes to taking care of what's going on in the team, when it comes to the human being, or you just, everybody's supposed to deliver?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. I mean, there's a especially in our team dynamic, we strive to be a high performance team, which means delivering on certain things and having it, and also coaching that to push people, and also we get pushed very, very vocally, and also very like wide, like you will read Twitter and something will have you like, okay, we got to get started on whatever was announced. But I think the intimate side of my team is there's very little hierarchy inside my team, so people feel like I would say free to sort of do their own thing and self-motivated, but then come back into the loop of like making sure they're just, you don't, my struggle is for creatives is they end up orbiting outside of where we need to be when it comes to the balance of all those things. So how do you take somebody back from orbiting that's healthy, but you also kind of bring her or he back into the world of saying, okay, but how does it align with the schedule? How does the thing? So there's that sort of blend between allowing enough freedom for somebody to fail, and also sometimes watching them fail is equally as hard. So how do you just send somebody out and based on your experience, you're like, oh, sometimes you're surprised, but most of the time you're like, oh, that's gonna hurt. And not hurt them physically, but just hurt emotionally or physically, because sometimes failures, it's just not that easy to deal with. You know, in the moment it hurts, you're embarrassed, people are, self-conscious about it. I think coming back and like having an open rapport of just getting it out there, as soon as it's said out loud, it ends up sort of dissolving very quickly, versus people that, like, most of the time corporate and somebody fails, there's not a safety because they're sort of isolated. No one knows how to approach them. So we've done some interesting one where it's like as part of a large group, and you of course you don't put somebody that much on the spot, but I tend to, for my world, I'll usually introduce it with one of my failures, so I lead a bit from the front, so people know that, hey, you're a human. Like same way that we talked today about like having just once you get it out there that like I was in charge of the most famous glass failure in the entire world, it kind of allows everyone to be like, wow, well, they's still alive, he still works for Tesla, he's still doing that stuff. So it's okay to, I talk about that a lot just for that reason, just to give other people like look at me and be like, yeah, I guess I should go try something new. Mike's still alive, he's still working at the company, to be able to have that freedom to go do that. I think there's a little bit of responsibility there that I feel, whether it's talking about it or teaching a class about it or writing a book about it. There's something in my mind when it happened, I was like, I kind of have to go tell the story. So I don't. This is my TED story. This is my failure story. But yeah, I struggle with that too, because like personal perception is huge. So how people view you and how people do that, and like there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that inside me as well. How raw do you get? How naked do you feel in front of people that you're able to sort of come back and still have things? I've noticed with my team, like when we went through a really cool exercise with going through like the last 2 years of your life, both personally and professionally, and doing a plus or minus scale of big events that happened that were really amazing and really traumatic. And what I found is that I learned more about people on my team during that 30-minute experiment, because people felt like, of course I had to get up and talk about personal issues, like being divorced, having like getting engaged, doing like having my Grayson, my child, and like then things in work, like an accomplishment, and then something like the glass failure, and then coming out of it. So like when I laid all that out and people were able to share, it was therapeutic for me, but also I saw that other people on my team were equally able to just sort of say like, oh, well, I guess it's okay to talk about that thing that's been on my mind for a while now. I wouldn't say that's a global aspect of Tesla. That's very specific to the 10 people on my team that feel very close and safe to share that stuff. Yeah.
I was thinking, because a lot of time at work, I had a great boss once, and he said that, I don't remember, but he was an economist and he had all the figures very figured out. And he said that a very big % of the time and at work had to do with relationships. At least your mind was occupied on that, or you were like having some kind of conflict undergoing, or think like that. And then I figured out that, oh, gosh, well, if you are at peace and if you are flowing with what you're doing and with your colleagues and everything, and that kind of environment, like you mentioned before, Mayra, the realizing, oh, what am I bringing into the team wavelength, so to say. So when it is when there's an optimal creative positive expanding, let's say, sense of beingness, that also influences into the others. And so I was a little curious about if you had that as a policy in Tesla, or it was just up to each one of the team leaders to do whatever they thought it was proper.
Yeah. I think it comes with the sort of, there's a saying in our world that people don't leave companies, they leave managers. That's always a saying that people that you end up in a situation. There's absolutely jobs at Tesla where I would not be able to survive. There's no doubt about it in my mind. Like you end up in a position where you need that balance between, being yourself, but also being a professional and also being driven by the right metrics. Yeah. But I do think there's something to the, like when Mayra was talking about the energy side of things, I found that being my struggle as well, is like if I get flustered or I get confused, even though I'm like trying to hide it as much as possible, whether that's at home or at the office, it pops. It's just like, yeah, it's written all over me. I don't need to say a word. So that's been my, I related to that quite well.
I was thinking that comes out to there's a concept called sovereignty as well that's been like used in the development, like as a your own personal sovereignty. And so like one of the things that would be an impediment to that, like when you go down on sovereignty, like when you don't have the full expansion of mind, or like you're at your full capacity. And so like one thing would of course be like in the moment you're embarrassed, or you do something that you find stupid, or you beat yourself up, or something comes up from a past experience that, where you get like, closed in, you're like your limbic system engages. But I think there's also that whole thing, like the balance, like I guess like the work-life balance, where you think, I mean, a lot of the culture that we still have is around, like you have work and you have life, and like there's a imagined separation between there, and that's also what I heard in the question. And but also like if you're going through a divorce, I mean, it's very hard to be as like at the top of your game, because you are going to be somewhere else, or if you have like burnout, like, exhaustion syndrome or whatever it might, or like you're, with the COVID crisis, like, we had a person who was like, who had a dad who was working on a boat with COVID cases. And so like, what is that? Like it narrows your energy, like the margin that you normally have. And so, there's something to that's again, like the balance perspective and this holistic perspective. And like when we are innovating, there's so much that it takes out of us to bring it back to that unless you have that sort of full like the space available, you could probably do, of course, if you have a lot of experience, you can rely on that, but it's probably not going to be as great as it would have been if you would have been fully sovereign. That's right. Then to bring it back to that initial. Cool. Any other thoughts or reflections or things we would like to present at this moment? I think we might just want to round off. I'm feeling a bit foggy in my head myself. So like, this has been a wonderful conversation. There's so much.
There was a question from an Elon on the chat, and then I just wonder, okay, is he checking on you, Michael? What?
He might be checking on you.
but there was.
I did see it. I did see it come up.
You did see it come up, yeah.
Elon was asking, how do you prioritize in your process? Is it time, design, scoping, building, sustainable stress level, other?
Yeah.
I guess now you better get it right then, since Elon was asking.
That's right, since Elon was asking. Yeah, I think I chatted about before. There's sort of a great graphic that I'll share with sort of like your ability to influence versus the time frame of the program, and overlaid with executive, I guess executive insight or exposure to that product. And it tends to be like your ability to influence at the start is high, and then it drops significantly and goes low. And executive exposure does this. There's a little blip earlier on, and then it goes really high right around like when your ability to influence starts to go really far down. And so like I'll tend to like it's sort of like it's hard work. It's like a simple philosophy, but really hard to do it. Is earlier on in a project that's sort of like self-motivation to get really busy early on and try to like prioritize things that don't have executive exposure is sort of like a gift. So the easiest time to get money and funding and budgetary stuff is when executive exposure is high, and people who are really good at the game are able to play around with that. Like, ooh, that's highlighted, that's on the top of the list, so I'm going to go ask for the money. The hard part about getting busy early on is trying to, I guess, like communicate enough urgency when there's no urgency in the product lifecycle. So how do you take urgency and put it in the front aspect and communicate to the executives, if you don't do this, we're not going to be able to do that, and it'll be too late in the product lifecycle. So I would say that it was less on sort of like the process and more on just knowing time and place to be able to say like, when do you get busy, and when, take care of yourself. When do you take a little bit of a break, take it like off, like how do you decide and take care of yourself as well as to push the team to really focus on stuff. So things that are 2.5 years out, I wake up every day worried about, even though, because the time, if we don't solve them right now, we wouldn't be able to it'll just be too late down in the process and things. So that's sort of my take on it, but it's not easy to do, because if no one's sort of like, you're still a person and a human. So if no one's really pushing you to do it, then doing it yourself, you end up like in a mind where it's like, am I just pushing this to just push it on my own, or is this really going to impact it, type of thing. So you do need that feedback of like just checking in with other people and colleagues, like, hey, am I on the right track here? Here's my thought process. Like I do that a lot as far as going to peers as well as mentors, just to check and do a loop, or else you end up solving a problem that's not a problem. Yeah.
Other reflections, thoughts? No? We're all talked out.
A really good session. The thoughts.
Thank you.
This was a really good session.
That was really inspiring. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you
very, very much.
Yeah, special thanks to everybody for participating, and a special thanks to Mayra and Mike for doing this with me. I've both enjoyed the previous talk and this one, and it's really nice. I think maybe we can check. Would we check out with like something that was I don't know. I mean, if it's too high of a bar, to like something new you learned, or like something you realized, or something like that. Something that a door that opened up, any door that opened up during the conversation. This is something you bring with you from this conversation. I can let you think and start. I thought that the something that I wrote down was like this distinction that you had, Mike, between a failure and a mistake, and I really like that sort of the precision in the language around those two. And it really resonated with me, because I've been kind of using them interchangeably in a sense, but you do want to create like a failure is a different thing than making a mistake. And of course it's okay to make a mistake, you're human and so forth, but I also have that sense, like when you're doing really critical things, there's a lot lower tolerance for mistakes, whereas to fail, to like genuinely and sort of earnestly fail, that's something that nobody could have thought about, or so I thought that was an eye opener. I love that use of language, so thanks for that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks, appreciate that.
Anybody who feels
for me, I yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is super inspiring. It's also really great to to meet everybody. Yeah, thanks for, and Mayra, thank you for adding your level of psychological expertise here into my world. I really, but one thing that jumped out at me was that sort of like when you opened it up with your sort of idea around like taking care of yourself and the energy you're putting out to other people. That absolutely resonated with me, because I felt like, yeah, that's like, and you know, sometimes it's healthy to hear it and to be like, yep, that's in my mind. I got it. You know, for me, I think I also I played around with the idea, and it's so healthy, and I really appreciate Niles and you guys putting this together, because I think like communication and being able to teach this stuff is really important. And I'm walking away inspired to do something like that. I've been inspired before. I kind of like, whether it's write a book, and I think we've talked about, I've played around with doing like a chorus or trying to figure out how to do that. So I'm more inspired now, and also like, you know, putting it out there, so I'm accountable to it. Yeah. But I really enjoyed it. Thank you all very much for being part of it. It's been nice.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amit, for hosting, and Mike for being here, and everyone for being here. I think one thing that I really loved, that really struck something with me, was Mike, you sharing like the difference between being there, being able to be there for your team, and being like that coach and giving that safety, and then how hard it is to also give that to yourself, or to how much easier it is to help other people than it is to help yourself, maybe. Or remember what to do when you're in the fog, or when you have the scares, or when something big like that happens. That was a really beautiful kind of reflection. So thank you.
Great.
Yeah, I very much agree with what you said, Mike, or what Mayra said. Like to focus on your own well-being, how important that is in every aspect of everything, I suppose. And even though it's something I'm very focused on myself, it's still something you forget, and it's still something you have to be reminded of in different sort of contexts, and to realize that it actually is, yeah, it's very important. So that's one of the things. But also, as I said, like the whole conversation was really, really good. And kudos to you, Amit, for bringing like two very different parts of innovation. I thought that was very interesting to have a clash, or rather like a immersion between like something soft-ish and something very hard. So I think that was
glass is really hard. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Hopefully really
It was
hard.
the universe. I have to give the universe credit for that. Thanks.
I really love the analogy of the fog. It's I'm adding that one to my toolbox of explanatory stories for sure. And Mayra, you said something about people freaking out in the fog, and I'm gonna pronounce it the freak out fog from now on. And yeah, the analogy is really great, I think, especially with Amit's learning how to use a compass when you're in the fog, and being accepting of not knowing where everything is in the fog, but knowing which direction you're going in, and perhaps knowing just what your overall sense of vision is, and being all right with everything else. So thank you for that download.
Maria Paz, do you feel called?
It was so it was so beautiful to just listen to the difference, and really take in the difference between being creative and innovative. Because I've seen myself as a very extremely creative human being with solutions to almost anything, both at a thought level but also practical. But then taking that into the world and doing it part of it, that's something that first time in my life I felt I couldn't do by myself. and suddenly with a team, with a group of people, the brain becomes bigger. and then it's possible to bring out into the world. And so thank you so much, because that's a very, it was, yeah, and the conversation, everything was beautiful. Thank you, all of you. It was beautiful. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. I don't know if Nils wants to. His screen just went white, and there's a lot of commotion going on there. Are you in a place, Nils, where you can hear us and want to share something, or should we just round off?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I
You
have
want
a
to check out?
2-year-old on my shoulders. So hence I haven't
Maybe
been
he has
very
some
active
wisdom.
in the session. But thank you guys. I've been listening in the whole time. And this has been great. Thank you, Mike, for taking part. Thank you, Mayra. And
Great.
Nico, do you want to say anything?
Hej älskling.
Yeah.
Hi.
You're amazing, guys. And we're going to get this up on YouTube shortly as well. So thank you all.
Great.
Now I'm going to get back to taking care of this guy and the limestone quarry and the other session.
Bye. Thanks, guys. Thanks
Great.
again so much. This is
Excellent.
fantastic. Have a good one. We'll speak soon, I hope.
Great. Bye, guys. Nice to
Thank
meet
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.